He is the great Mike Heller. He is heard statewide in Wisconsin on Fox Sports Radio and also fills in for Rich Eisen and Dan Patrick. A pleasure to have Mike Heller with us. I'm Bryan Fenley, an anchor with Fox Sports Radio. And Mike, this will give us an opportunity to dive into your career. You've got
Yeah.
some interesting twists and turns around the way to get to where you are today. And so it'll be interesting and fascinating to look at this. First of all, appreciate your time. And before you became this radio icon, and let's be honest, you've reached that status. What were some of the strenuous activities and grunt work you would put in just to get your name out there, trying to break in and make yourself presentable to the business?
Yeah, I think it probably begins, I spent 10 years or so being a sports anchor on local news in a really small market in Wisconsin, a little small town called Rhinelander in the Northwoods of Wisconsin for a year and a half. And then in Madison, Wisconsin for about 3.5, 4 years, and in Memphis, Tennessee. And I think from the time I was in Madison, my return back about 5 years later, the time I was in Madison, I made enough of a name for myself to kind of open some doors. And that's really kind of in the integration time of sports talk radio that just wasn't there. So we're talking about the late 1980s into the mid 1990s when I came back to Madison. And then kind of the integration of sports talk radio, and I had already established myself through some work with the University of Wisconsin, some of their sports programs, and my television work as a commodity, somebody that people knew here. So I think that was the part of it. And then the other things just happened, and it's like you've heard a thousand times, Brian. It was relationships. Who I knew, my relationship with Barry Alvarez, the athletic director, and with certain coaches that helped to open some of those doors. So, sometimes it's good fortune, sometimes it's some ability and good fortune, and when those two come together, and I suppose that was it for the timing for me.
Let's go right to that relationship with Barry Alvarez, because looking at your bio, that seemed to be you working with Barry. It exploded your radio career and got you out there. When did you feel that while the work you did with Barry was enjoyable and you had never wanted to stop that, you saw bigger things ahead for you as well, from what you were hearing from people who thought your work was really, really strong and you were very well received in what you were doing?
Yeah, I think so. The opinion side of what I was able to do in sports talk radio, which is nothing that we were ever able to do on the TV side, right? So the TV side was very much like driving a bus. You would be glib and try and be funny, getting out of highlight packages, and your crosstalks were where you sold what you were doing. Radio was so totally different. Sports TV, you had 3.5 to 4.5 minutes in my time of doing it. But in radio, you had 3 hours, sometimes 4 hours, which is an hour too long. But you had that window, and kind of cutting my teeth in some of the stuff I did on an interview side with Barry on some weekly stuff helped. But then certainly the idea of getting in front of people from an opinion standpoint, um, on the radio side, was really where I felt like it was natural for me. Because then, Brian, it turned into being able to talk like you would sitting and having a bourbon or a glass of wine, which is, by the way, where I am. My wife and I own a wine bar
That's awesome.
just outside of Madison. So that a little bit of the funky background you see on the wall is I go from radio to our wine bar on most days. So anyways, I turned some of that and some of the people I knew into that 3-hour opinion concept, and then was able to use some of those connections and just some good fortune to kind of attach into a connection through the Dan Patrick Show, and then to later attach from that to the Rich Eisen Show and some of the other national stuff with Fox.
How did they first hear of you? And when you first heard of their interest in you, what came to mind?
Yeah, so that's when we launched. We took Dan Patrick's show in Madison And then we launched a station in Milwaukee. iHeart, the group that I was with and was with at the time, decided to launch a all sports in Milwaukee. So Dan and the Danettes came in to do a market visit in Milwaukee and to run in the famous Brewers sausage race. So now they tell that story, but Dan was in it too. So they were the five sausages in
Gosh.
the middle of the fifth inning sausage race in Milwaukee. Um, anyway, so they did the market visit. We had a dinner, some of the suits from the radio group, and Dan came in and had a dinner with us on Friday night. We had a little chance to talk then, but then Chris Crane, who at the time was the executive producer of the show and somewhat had launched it all the way back in the day, or was with them in that
Mm.
process. He and I visited when they went down to do the sausage race. We were in a suite at Miller Park at the time. Now it's American Family Field coming up this year. We're at Miller Park, and we had 2.5 innings to chat it up, and we had the same view on sports talk. And what Chris said is, I'm going to listen to your show. I've heard it before, but I'm going to listen to your show more intently as we fill in with some guest hosts. Would you have some interest? And my heart kind of fluttered. I was like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah. So, and then honestly, Brian, I didn't think anything of it. That's a July. I think it's a July, June or July. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
Market visit that they had, and then at some point, nothing happened. And all of a sudden, in mid-September, I get this email from Chris. Hey, you're on the approved list now for guest hosts. We'll reach out when we have a spot. And I was like, "What?" We celebrated. My wife and I, we celebrated like, "Oh my God, this is fantastic!" And again, another 2 months goes by, and I don't hear a word.
Yeah.
And then I don't know, a couple of weeks before Thanksgiving, Chris reached out, called me, and said, "How about the day after Thanksgiving, Black Friday? It'd be a radio only deal, and would you be up for that?" And it was one of the coolest things ever. And that was kind of a trial, how do you do? And I did good enough. So they had me back before and after Christmas. And then, for, I don't know, I suppose the next 3 or 4 years, I was a pretty regular guest host on the radio side only, with one exception. Radio side only for the next 3 or 4 years. And that ended up moving towards the Rich Eisen show for another 3 or 4 years.
What has Rich or even Dan said about your work in terms of their feedback or what you've been able to do as far as connecting with them over these years?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing there for me is not much. So
That's a good
the
thing.
fact, yeah, to me, it was more along the line of, I think like when I go away, if I'm vacationing, somebody's filling in on my show statewide in Wisconsin, I will sometimes listen, but typically I'm getting away to get away.
Yeah.
And my guess is that they didn't listen, but the producers did, and they probably aren't going to have you back if it just, oh, he was awkward or talked about things. Here, the one, and it's not necessarily a positive. So there was a storyline that was brewing on UConn women's basketball, and I'm filling in on the Rich Eisen show. It's maybe the second time I had done it, and the Gino Auriemma story and UConn's dominance at the time, I don't know what had triggered that to be kind of a national story, but I was on it a little bit. And then during the middle of the show, I'd maybe spent a couple of segments on it. In the middle of the show, I get an email from one of the higher ups at FSR, who would always be the one that set me up to do it,
Hmm.
said, Rich is really not happy you're talking all this women's basketball. Can you move back to something else? And that's the only time ever that I had Rich or Dan reach out to say, hey, and that was certainly fine. And that the cool thing about that is that it also didn't stop me from doing, they had me back many, 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 many
Yeah.
times afterwards. So Rich obviously must have thought enough of what I did, even though he didn't want that topic necessarily to carry much more length. That was the one thing, and it was a little intimidating to get a note in the middle of the show because I don't get that normally. But I've had Rich on my show, and I've had Dan on my show. In fact, I had Dan as a guest on Dan's show twice. where I
Really?
was guest hosting Dan's show and had Dan as a guest, which was kind of cool.
What was that like when you had that sort of
Oh,
dynamic?
yeah, the Dan one is the most interesting to me because I got a phone call kind of in an emergency. I never understood what the emergency was. Dan was in Sochi covering the Winter Olympic Games with NBC. And on Monday during my afternoon show, I got a call from Chris Crane, who was the guy who set me up to do it originally. Well, he knows what time I'm on the air. So for him to call me during my show, I was kind of freaked out. So I called him as soon as we went to commercial break, and he said, "We have an emergency. Can you come out to Milford, Connecticut, and do the show here on Wednesday and Thursday?"
Wow.
And it's like, what did he think I was going to say? No.
Yeah.
So I said, yeah, just, so then the show was owned by DirecTV at the time. That whole night, then I'm communicating with DirecTV on flights and hotels and everything else. And so I'm in studio then with Paulie and Fritzy and McLovin and Seaton, and they booked Dan as a guest so I'm sitting in Dan's chair in Dan's studio doing a Dan show with Dan on the show as a guest. And it was crazy. I think the first thing I said is, there's probably a few things on your desk that aren't going to be here when you get back, because, which was, and then I knew it was the wrong thing to say to him because he said, "Mike, I know where everything on my desk is, and I know where you live." So, it's one of those moments. It's surreal, pretty cool.
What's also pretty cool, Mike, is the fact that your run in sports media had a stop in golf teaching, and
Yeah.
certainly your love and fondness for the golf course. How would you take those experiences as a teaching pro, and in what ways would you parlay that into helping you as a radio host, if you could see a way that those two could correlate?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a work ethic involved in what we do that you have to live and breathe this game of sports talk radio all the time. So in life, I live the things I do, whether it's, sometimes some night at the wine bar, somebody will say something, I'll bring that back. Or if it's in covering this event or that event, or in the number of hours you spend watching things. The golf industry, if you're in it, um, it is a grind and a half. As a teacher, as a club pro, there's a lot of time spent in it, and you can't shortcut it. So I think that's the thing I learned there, Bryan, is that in golf, in teaching, and in running a shot, you can't fake anything. If you fake it, if you don't put the work in, the people that are there, they know it. And I think in doing what we do in a talk format, you can't fake that you didn't see the game last night. First thing I think I figured out
Yeah.
relatively quickly, if you didn't see it and somebody calls in and says, that third down play in the third quarter when they're down 8 points, what's up with that call?
Yeah.
If you try to fake it, you're done, because the listener sees through it right away. The same thing I've always felt was true in the golf industry. If I didn't know why you were blocking the ball to the right or why it was slicing, typically you could figure something out. But if I didn't know it, you could experiment with a couple of things, but you can't lie about it. You can't. You have to go, you know what? I'm not sure what you're doing, because if you tell them they're doing the wrong thing, you're going to screw them up even worse. So I think that's the one thing I suppose I learned is work ethic is one thing that you can apply across both fronts, and the other is you can't fake it, and don't make it up, because somebody's going to catch you and you lose all credibility.
Well, yeah, and we're joined by Mike Heller, who's heard statewide in Wisconsin on Fox Sports Radio, also filling in on the national network as well, has done it for Rich Eisen and Dan Patrick. And I'm Bryan Fenley. Mike, I bet that at times over the years, you develop that ear for when you think maybe a host hasn't really watched the game, like they're
Yeah.
the box score readers, and you're like, hey, I'm getting a lot of stats, and I don't know how well that sounds over the air, and you're not getting actual vivid images of what's taking place on the court or on the field. And as far as the format of your show in Wisconsin, I know you work with John Arias. What is it about the way you two work together that seems to really shine on the air?
Well, I think we start with our differences. I didn't play professionally, but I grew up as an athlete, and played a little bit in college. So, and I will always compete. I compete now if I'm on a golf course or a racquetball court or a tennis court, whatever that is. I'm competitive. If I'm playing Catan or cards or cribbage or whatever, I mean, I'm competitive on that front, and he's not. So, so there's an odd couple kind of a
Yeah.
concept there. Um, he'll call me on the things that he thinks I'm being too hard headed on, or have maybe missed the point, and I will do the same there. And in co-host situations, you have to be able to locker room talk. You have to be able to call them out. You have to. I think those are the funniest moments. Is when you truly sting somebody like you would in a locker room, and I think we can both do that a little bit. I might be more inclined to go there than he is. I think he's nicer than me. So I think that that's where, and the fact that, we've been doing this now together. I've been on in Madison since '02. So it's almost 20 years that I've been doing sports talk here. And he's been with me for the last 11 years of that. So there's a lot of work together concept. And I think it helps that we don't do anything together away from work.
Okay.
Never, ever. Maybe a little bit of golf. We've golfed occasionally, but we come together for that 4 hour window, three on the air and a half an hour on either side. But that's our rapport. And other people do it differently. Other people are together all the time, but not us.
So no matter how many hours of the day you're with him, you're always competitive 24/7. And I'm sure the competition and that drive fuels itself in your wine bar, not only in what you do in sports hosting and on the radio side of things. What's the difference, Mike, of your personality when it comes to hosting a radio show and working and overseeing a busy night at the wine bar?
I think the kind of cool thing here, and Kari, my wife, and we're the primaries here. We're the only owners, so we're here a lot. I'm totally different off the air than I am on, um, with the exception of once the conversation, if somebody comes into the bar and wants to talk about sports, I probably don't back down. That's probably the only time that I am not a gregarious wine bar owner. And it's a wine bar, or wine, bourbon, beer. So it's more of a bar than it is like a wine tasting room kind of a concept. So in that regard, I think I'm way different than I am on the air, because on the air I can be um, very much set in my opinion, my way. And you don't want to do that here. The customer is right. Unless the customer wants to talk about Aaron Rodgers,
There you go.
then now you're bringing me into my element, and I'm going to probably be right at the end of that conversation.
Yeah, the pompous sports
Yeah,
mania only comes out when
right.
appropriate and when it doesn't affect
Yeah.
somebody from coming in and having a couple glasses of wine. We're joined by Mike Keller. My final question for you, Mike, is what's an interview that you've done on the air that was most hard hitting? And it might have gone away that you had no intention of it going, but you left it in awe and you just said, wow, that was golden radio for all to hear based
Yeah.
upon the
So
content.
Yeah, so we did a piece a few years ago. I used to work with a guy by the name of Owen Murphy, and Owen's really good in the business. Owen was with ESPN. He worked with with Dan Patrick Show back all the way back in the day. Worked with Dan. He still does a lot of ESPN stuff. He produces some of the game broadcasts. So Owen and I were doing a show, and he had the connection to Sal Paolantonio. This is all the way back to Favre days,
Okay.
and Sal Pal had he thought that Brett Favre was overrated. And so we had Sal on the show, and I said that, I talked about the concept of what I thought, not overrated, he's overhyped. Like the coverage of him was too constant. There was too much Brett Favre stuff. And I didn't expect Sal, and I didn't expect me, because Sal's a national guy. I didn't expect it to get contentious, and it got contentious, and then it got funny contentious. Like, Sal, you got me fired up now. And you could just hear the smile on his face. And I don't know if that's exactly what I would call hard hitting, but in the moment, it felt like, Oh shoot, I am going toe to toe here with Sal Paolantonio. What the hell am I doing? But it turned into, I think we both thought we were right, but it turned into fairly strongly opinionated and fun rather than strongly opinionated and all of a sudden, hey, did Sal hang up? Kind
Yeah.
of a concept, which it didn't happen. And it's still, to me, that along with, I had a segment a few years ago before he passed away with Bart Starr talking about the Ice Bowl because Green Bay was going to host a playoff game that weekend and it was going to be really cold. And so Bart and Cherry Star, his wife, every time I would call their house, one of them would answer. And if they didn't, and I got a housekeeper or somebody else that I would leave a message, one of them would call me back every time, Brian, every time.
Wow.
So I did a segment with Bart Starr on in one segment, and Cherry followed because I talked to both of them because she was at the game. And then my dad, who's still with us, thank goodness, my dad was on in the following segment because he was at the Ice Bowl. I was 5 years old at the time, 4 years old. Anyway, those two times, Sal Pal's interview, and then the back-to-back segments with Bart and Cherry Star, and then my dad, probably the most memorable for me, other
Okay.
than the national stuff. Yeah.
You can't bring up your dad and him being on the air with you without describing what it was like having him on. And did he rattle you? Did he make fun of you? Was he playfully critical of you? What was that scenario like as I finish off?
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I'm doing it after Bart. So I said this recently when Hank Aaron passed away that growing up in Wisconsin, my two sports heroes, and I don't use the term anymore. I don't have a sports hero living today, but my two
Wow.
sports heroes were Bart Starr and Hank Aaron. And I never dropped the hero portion of it. And I got to spend some time with Bart. I never did with Hank Aaron, which is a sadness for me, but I always loved and appreciated everything that he did. Following up the Star interview with my dad, I'd never had my dad on the radio before. I'm not cut from his tree in, he's not much of a talker. He's very stoic. He doesn't watch a ton of sports anymore, but he certainly was a big sports fan. Having him on afterwards, I was worried that my dad wouldn't be as glib and as talkative and take it where I was going to try and go. And he absolutely did. And he was
Wow.
funny. And, he talked about that scenario where he and his brother-in-law walked around the stadium looking for tickets because they went to the Ice Bowl without tickets. And I thought it was just a great segment. And it's one of those that, like I said, I'll see him tomorrow. He's with me. But that segment, which I didn't know what it would be, ended up being gold. Loved it.
See, Mike, I guess your father does have that talkative gene a little bit
Yeah,
inside
right.
of him, even if it takes being on the air and feeling the pressure of being on live radio to get it out of him. Mike Heller,
Yeah.
check out his show, 2 to 5 p.m. Central Time in Wisconsin, wherever, Fox Sports Radio. He's also a regular fill-in for several different shows, including doing work with Dan Patrick and Rich Eisen. Also, go check out his wine bar if you're in the area, and I'm sure he would love that. Mike, it's been a pleasure. I'm Bryan Fenley, an anchor at FSR. Really appreciate you, man, and thanks so much for doing this. You do a great job.
Thanks for having me. I love doing it.